Islam Makhachev was almost erased before his career was allowed to exist. Not because he wasn't talented, not because he failed repeatedly, but because one night arrived too early, at the exact moment when the system had no reason to wait, no incentive to protect, and no patience for explanation. In combat sports, timing is not just about strikes and takedowns, it's about when a mistake happens. A loss at the wrong stage doesn't teach lessons, it rewrites perception. It turns potential into doubt. It transforms a developing fighter into a question mark the division would rather move past than resolve. This video is not about a knockout or a bad performance. It's about how fragile early careers really are, and how a single result can quietly place a fighter on the edge of irrelevance without anyone announcing it out loud. Islam Makhachev didn't almost disappear because he was beaten. He almost disappeared because he was beaten before the sport decided he mattered. What followed that night wasn't chaos or collapse. It was something far colder. Silence, delayed opportunities, a shift in how risk was calculated around him. From that moment on, Islam wasn't just fighting opponents. He was fighting the possibility that the system had already made up its mind. This is the tragic night that almost erased Islam Makhachev, and the reason the fighter who survived it would never allow chance, emotion, or unpredictability to touch his career again. At the time of that night, Islam Makhachev occupied the most vulnerable position a fighter can have in the UFC. Early, unestablished, and easily replaceable. He was not a headline name. He was not a promotional priority. He was one of many athletes being evaluated rather than invested in. And that distinction matters more than talent ever does. In this phase, results don't exist in isolation. They are interpreted as signals. A win suggests potential. A loss suggests limits. And crucially, a loss that arrives before a fighter has leverage is not treated as part of a learning curve. It's treated as information about whether further time should be spent at all. This is not cruel. It's structural. The UFC signs more fighters than it can ever promote. Early filtering is built into the system. What made that night dangerous wasn't the fact of defeat, but how little margin Islam had when it happened. He had not yet accumulated the kind of goodwill that reframes losses as setbacks instead of warnings. There was no narrative buffer, no market pressure, no audience demand that required patience. From the system's point of view, there were other options, other prospects, other paths forward. This is why early losses carry disproportionate weight. They don't just affect confidence, they affect trajectory. Matchmaking slows. Opponents become less meaningful. Opportunities stop arriving in sequence. A fighter can still compete, but progress becomes conditional rather than assumed. For Islam, that night placed him in a silent category. The sport never labels publicly. Fighters who must now prove they are worth the inconvenience, worth the risk, worth the slot, worth delaying someone else's momentum. And once a fighter enters that category, nothing is automatic anymore. This is the edge he was standing on. Not collapse, not failure, but irrelevance through delay. A career that doesn't end, but never quite begins. That was the real threat created that night. And it's why everything that followed became about control, precision, and eliminating reasons for doubt rather than chasing redemption. What followed that night was not backlash, criticism, or public doubt. It was something far more dangerous for a developing fighter. Nothing. The division did not stop to reassess Islam Makhachev. It simply continued moving. Cards were booked, matchups were made, new names entered the picture, and Islam was no longer part of the immediate conversation. This kind of silence is not accidental. In the UFC's structure, attention is a resource, and it flows toward volatility, marketability, and momentum. Fighters who lose early without having generated demand don't become problems to solve. They become variables that can be postponed. Islam's career did not stall visibly, but it slowed in ways that only fighters and matchmakers feel: longer waits, less urgency, fewer clear pathways forward. Importantly, this wasn't a punishment. It was a recalibration. Early losses change how risk is perceived around a fighter. Matchmakers become cautious, opponents hesitate, The cost of booking that fighter increases because the upside is no longer obvious. A win over him doesn't build a name. A loss to him carries consequences. That imbalance makes him harder to place. For Islam, this meant operating in a professional limbo. He was still competing, still training, still improving, but without the feedback loop that tells a fighter his progress is being acknowledged. Wins no longer accelerated opportunity. They simply prevented disappearance. Each fight became about staying visible enough to remain relevant, rather than advancing toward a defined goal. This is where psychological pressure deepens. Not through stress or panic, but through uncertainty. When effort no longer produces predictable results, motivation has to be restructured. Islam wasn't chasing the belt at this stage. He was chasing continuity, the ability to keep moving at all. The tragedy here isn't that the system doubted him. It's that the system had no reason to decide either way. And for a fighter early in his career, that indecision is as dangerous as rejection. This is the point where Islam Makhachev's response diverged from what most fighters do in the same position. He did not try to compensate with urgency. He did not chase finishes, rivalries, or statements. Instead, he reassessed what the system was actually responding to and adjusted accordingly. The lesson of that night was not that he needed to be better in moments of chaos. It was that chaos itself carried unacceptable risk when margin was gone. Early in a career, volatility can accelerate recognition. After an early setback, volatility becomes liability. Islam understood that distinction quickly, and it reshaped how he approached every fight that followed. From that point on, his priorities narrowed. The goal was no longer to impress, it was to remove doubt. He began structuring fights so that outcomes were difficult to argue with and harder to misinterpret. Less exposure, fewer swings in momentum, no unnecessary exchanges that could reintroduce randomness into the result. This wasn't fear-driven caution, it was strategic restraint. Importantly, this shift aligns with what actually happened next in his career. Islam went on extended winning runs built on control, consistency, and positional dominance rather than spectacle. The fights didn't announce themselves loudly, but they accumulated. Each one served the same function, reducing the number of excuses the system could use to delay him again. This approach came with a cost. Controlled victories generate less public momentum. They don't create viral moments or instant narratives, but they do something else. They make avoidance harder to justify. Opponents can dismiss chaos. They can wait out hype. They struggle to argue with repeated, clean outcomes. What began as a response to near erasure became a defining characteristic. Islam wasn't just adapting to survive the system. He was learning how to operate inside it without giving it leverage over him again. And once that mindset sets in, it doesn't disappear when opportunity finally returns. It becomes the foundation of everything that follows. By the time Islam Makhachev began putting distance between himself and that early setback, the damage, or more accurately, the adaptation was already complete. The UFC did not suddenly reverse course or publicly reframe his trajectory. What changed was subtler and slower. His performances became too consistent to ignore, yet too controlled to rush. This created a prolonged middle period in his career, where he was winning regularly, sometimes impressively, but without the acceleration that usually follows momentum. That pattern is documented in how his matchups progressed. Solid opponents, clear victories, incremental movement rather than leaps. For a fighter shaped by that early night, this was confirmation, not frustration. It validated the conclusion he had already drawn that opportunity would not arrive through excitement, but through inevitability. This period is essential to understanding why that night nearly erased him, and why it also permanently changed him. Islam did not fight as if he expected the system to reward patience. He fought as if patience was something he alone had to manufacture. Every fight became an exercise in risk management, not because he lacked confidence, but because he no longer trusted timing. He had learned that being next meant nothing unless it was undeniable. So he focused on removing uncertainty round by round, opponent by opponent, building a record that didn't ask questions, it answered them. From the outside, this can look like a natural stylistic evolution. From the inside, It is the residue of that early threat of erasure. Fighters who feel secure can afford to experiment. Fighters who have felt how close the floor really is do not. Islam's approach narrowed not out of fear, but out of memory. He had already seen how quickly a career could lose priority. That awareness does not fade just because wins accumulate. This is also why his rise later felt strangely muted. There was no sudden transformation moment, no visible shedding of doubt. The doubt had been addressed years earlier, in private, through structure rather than expression. When the sport finally had to acknowledge him, it wasn't because he demanded attention. It was because ignoring him had become inefficient. And that is the lasting consequence of that early night. Islam didn't just survive it. He reorganized his entire professional identity around never being vulnerable to it again. By the time Islam Makhachev finally stood in a position the UFC could no longer postpone, the night that almost erased him had already done its full work. There was no emotional reckoning left to resolve, no insecurity waiting to be healed by success. The fighter who emerged years later was not someone still proving a point. He was someone who had already closed the question internally. This is the final consequence of that early threat of erasure. Islam no longer built his career around expectation. He built it around non-negotiability. Every phase of his development after that night points in the same direction, reducing variance, eliminating surprise, and making outcomes predictable, regardless of opponent. This wasn't about fear of losing again. It was about never allowing a single result to redefine his value in the system. When fighters speak about learning from a loss, they usually mean technical adjustments or mental toughness. What Islam learned was structural. He learned how careers are actually treated when they lack leverage. He learned how quickly patience disappears when a fighter hasn't yet become useful. And once you understand that, you don't fight for applause or approval anymore. You fight to remove dependency. This is why his later dominance feels so procedural. There is no sense of release when he wins. No catharsis, just confirmation. The urgency that drives many champions never returned, because urgency belongs to fighters who believe opportunity can still be taken away. Islam stopped believing that only after he made himself unavoidable. The tragic night didn't end his career. It taught him how fragile careers really are. And once that lesson is absorbed, it doesn't fade with success. It becomes the framework through which every decision is made. Islam Makhachev didn't escape that night by forgetting it. He escaped it by building a career where it could never matter again. After that night, Islam Makhachev didn't just carry a loss. He carried a label. And in elite MMA, labels matter more than records. Early in a career, fighters are not judged on patterns. They're judged on impressions. One moment can outweigh 5 clean performances if it arrives at the wrong time. Islam's early defeat became shorthand. Not spoken loudly, but quietly understood. Talented, but fragile. Skilled, but unproven under pressure. Good, maybe not special. This label didn't follow him publicly. It followed him structurally. It affected matchmaking. It affected urgency. It affected how much tolerance existed for anything that looked uncertain. Islam was no longer evaluated as someone who could be shaped into a future centerpiece. He was evaluated as someone who needed to disprove doubt repeatedly before being trusted again. That changes how a fighter exists. Every bout stopped being just another step forward. It became a referendum, not on skill, but on reliability. Islam wasn't asked to excite. He was asked to not fail. And the burden of that expectation doesn't show up in statistics. It shows up in how carefully a career must be managed afterward. This is why his path looked slower than it should have, why momentum never felt automatic, why each win felt like it reset skepticism instead of eliminating it. Labels don't disappear when you win once. They disappear when the sport runs out of reasons to keep them. Islam understood that. And he responded by doing the one thing that erodes labels better than arguments ever could. He made them irrelevant. Surviving that early label did not come for free. What Islam Makhachev gained in security, he paid for in something harder to measure. Range. Range of expression, range of identity, range of acceptable outcomes. Once a fighter learns that one bad night can stall an entire career, the definition of success narrows permanently. Islam didn't just learn how to win, he learned what kind of winning was allowed. Clean, controlled, low variance. Anything else invited interpretation. And interpretation was the enemy. The system had already shown him how quickly it could misread a moment. This is where survival turns into structure. Islam's fights became designed not to test limits, but to remove them. He didn't chase moments that could be remembered incorrectly. He didn't build rounds around risk-reward calculations that assumed forgiveness. He built them around certainty. If a position could be stabilized, it was stabilized. If momentum could be flattened, it was flattened. The goal was never to look dominant, it was to leave no alternative explanation for the result. The cost of this approach is subtle but real. Fighters who operate this way rarely develop visible joy in competition. There's no emotional release, no indulgence in danger, no flirting with chaos for its own sake. Every decision is filtered through memory. What happens if this goes wrong? And once that filter exists, it never fully disappears. This is why Islam often appears detached even in victory. He is not reacting to the moment, he is confirming a process. The fight doesn't end with relief, because relief belongs to fighters who still believe things could have gone another way. Islam stopped believing that years ago, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. The tragedy here is not that he became cautious, it's that caution became permanent. The loneliest part of survival is realizing that the version of yourself who fought freely may no longer be compatible with staying alive in the system. Islam didn't just adapt to avoid erasure, he accepted the trade. Stability over spontaneity, longevity over expression. And that choice worked. It made him champion. But it also sealed off a version of him the sport never got to see and never will. Winning the belt should have rewritten everything. For most fighters, it does. It reframes losses, softens past doubts, and replaces scrutiny with celebration. For Islam Makhachev, it did none of that. The structure he built to survive before the belt remained exactly the structure he relied on after it. This is the final echo of that early night. Championships usually grant freedom to take risks, to experiment, to perform. Islam didn't take that freedom because he had already learned it was conditional. Titles can be taken away. Momentum can evaporate. Public narratives can turn. The belt didn't erase the memory of how quickly the system once moved past him. It simply confirmed that his insulation strategy worked. So nothing changed. Not the pace, not the risk tolerance, not the emotional distance. Islam didn't suddenly fight louder or looser, because doing so would reintroduce the same variables he spent years removing. He continued to minimize volatility, flatten exchanges, and deny opponents moments that could swing perception. The belt wasn't a reward. It was another responsibility to maintain certainty. This is why his championship reign feels different to watch. There's no sense of release, no cathartic shift into dominance as performance. What you see is continuity. The same habits, the same priorities, the same refusal to invite chance. From the outside, that can read as cold. From the inside, it's consistency, the only currency he learned to trust. The tragedy here is subtle. Success usually heals early wounds by replacing scarcity with abundance. Islam's success validated scarcity instead. It proved that caution, not expression, had been correct all along. That lesson doesn't dissolve with gold around your waist. It hardens. So the belt didn't change Islam Makhachev. It confirmed the version of him that survived the night that almost erased everything and ensured that version would never need to change again. The night that almost erased Islam, Makhachev never truly ended. It didn't stay behind him as a lesson learned or a scar healed. It became the quiet architecture of everything that followed. The way he fights, the way he manages risk, the way he refuses to give moments a chance to betray him. This is why his story feels tragic without ever being dramatic. There is no collapse, no redemption arc that restores balance. There is only adaptation so complete that nothing else can survive beside it. The system tested him early, withdrew patience, and moved on without explanation. Islam responded by removing every dependency that made him vulnerable to that treatment ever again. He didn't overcome that night by proving people wrong. He overcame it by making their opinions irrelevant, by building a version of himself that does not rely on forgiveness, momentum, or timing, a fighter who doesn't need to be understood to win, a champion who doesn't need affirmation to function. The tragedy isn't that Islam Makhachev was nearly erased. The tragedy is that the experience worked. It taught him how little room exists for error. It taught him that silence is not neutral, and it taught him to never leave space for interpretation again. That night didn't disappear from his career. It became the reason his career can no longer be threatened.